Welcome to Forced Perspective. I don't like this place. Today we'll be taking a look at Crossing Souls, where friendship and the bonds between brothers can change the world. Which is a beautiful message. I just have a problem where it reminds me of how my brother was never there. Yeah. So, I don't have a brother. In a small Californian town during the 1980s, a plucky young group of 4 friends, Chris, Matt, Charlie, and Big Joe, gonna let that hang there for a bit, gather together and head to their treehouse to hear what life-changing news Kevin, Chris's little brother, has to tell them. And, well, long story short, after looting the corpse, they find an artifact called the Duat Stone. That, with a little help from Matt, the group's nerd, allows them to see and interact with the world of the dead. And from there, wacky hijinks ensue. For a little bit, and then it gets pretty depressing, actually. Because while it does start off as a fairly lighthearted kids' ensemble adventure story similar to The Goonies, I was surprised the direction it goes. Not to spoil anything past the first hour, because that's where the demo ends, but it quickly turns into more of a drama. Legitimately terrible things happen to these children, and it was great! That's perhaps not the tone I should take when saying that, but it's true. In fact, that twist was enough to keep me interested despite some character writing problems. Not that I'm exactly an expert in the field. Most of my experience with creative writing comes from these videos, and I mean, watch those. Please? We have fun here. But seriously, this game does have a bit of a problem with telling rather than showing when it comes to character interactions. Big Joe and Charlie are as close as siblings, always looking out for each other no matter what, is something that is said a few times. So, I guess it's true. It's never cemented past saying it again in a more dramatic setting, but their bonds are extremely strong. Apparently. But more than that even, the kids just don't act right. The few character traits that are presented about them, they aren't consistent with. The only thing consistent about them is that they'll say whatever random thing they need to in order to get you to move to the next area, regardless of their supposed traits or even if it makes sense. Come on, Chris. I know something horribly traumatic happened literally 10 seconds ago, but we have to keep moving. Don't you remember when someone else said that? Well, now me, Charlie, am saying. It sounds weird. It makes me feel not like I'm along for the ride with these relatable characters, but instead like I'm watching horrible things happen to poorly emulated robot children as some sick blood sport, which isn't something I thought I wanted. I did, apparently. Which is disturbingly consistent with that tone issue from earlier. In fact, I had kind of wished they'd gone a little darker with it, you know, sort of a all or nothing. I'm a bad person. Yeah, but with that said, everything else, not the last part, I did enjoy the story that was being told. A few of the scenes missed their mark because of the issues I mentioned, but overall the story kept me engaged. Other things kept me less engaged, but that's the gameplay. Crossing Souls is an action-adventure game. Crossing Souls is a video game with a colorful pixelated style that I like quite a bit. For whatever reason, it reminded me of a few old LucasArts adventure games, and it got me feeling a little nostalgic. Which is clearly what they were going for, but maybe not that one in particular. See, the game is nostalgia bait, but it mostly focuses on 80s TV and movies. And it is very focused on them, with everything from posters to a small DeLorean time machine button tapping section. Now, I normally wouldn't take issue with this sort of thing, and I still don't really, but them being everywhere takes away some of the fun for me. Plus, when your secrets are also 80s references and the rest of the game has desensitized you to those references, I'm not really inclined to look for them. Like, this mysterious hidden sewer rat is interesting. He's surrounded by pizza boxes, and that's cool, but it's not really special anymore. Although, that could just be because I've never actually watched The Secret of Nim. But, ignoring that, which can be rather difficult, the game itself is pretty simple, focusing on using different characters' abilities together in order to get past puzzles and other obstacles. Going down the list, Chris can jump, climb certain surfaces, and reflect projectiles with his bat. Matt has hover boots and a laser gun capable of powering on switches. Big Joe can move heavy objects and is therefore the cause of all the push-block puzzles. So, thanks for that. Charlie can slingshot herself across large chasms using her jump rope and anchor points, while also having a pretty useful dash. And Kevin can also jump. Kevin's not very good. At least not at first. Later on, he does gain the ability to interact with the spirit world more directly, and can be split from the party, which is the only real change in gameplay that they semi-regularly stick to. I mean, there is a bike and shoot 'em up section, but those are one-offs and combined last about 3 minutes. So I suppose giving Kevin some credit makes sense. I have immediately changed my mind. Let's move on to the combat. At least we'll be safe from him there. Oh, God. Anyways, the combat is also not very complex. Wildly swinging works pretty well most of the time. There is a dodge for each character, but it's largely unnecessary. With the recovery animation at the end of it, you're probably making yourself more vulnerable than if you had just walked out of the way. It's useful, I suppose, if there's only a small number of enemies, but that is super uncommon, so don't. Past that, you can switch between characters at any time, which might make you think that switching characters in combat could be a good idea. Might add some depth to the fights, and it's sort of useful for managing your stamina bars, and although Big Joe is slow, he deals more damage than the others, so if an enemy gets stunned, normally by themselves, then he can clean up pretty quick. Or if you have to avoid a lot of things, Charlie is overall faster, and her dodge and dash are just better than everything. But really, as long as you stay away from Matt and his pathetic laser rifle, you can pretty much get away with whatever you want. Hell, even when it comes to the items, be it healing or the AoE stun, you don't need to use them most of the time. The only item I didn't consistently have the maximum of were the pipe bombs the homeless guy gave me. And that wasn't combat, it was me blowing up areas looking for things. The truth is, combat is easy. Unless you're using a keyboard and mouse, then it's only slightly less so, actually. It's surprisingly not awful. And I'm not trying to insult the developers there, but that is inevitably what I assume when I see one of these "use a controller, idiot" screens. It's a personal problem, I guess. But really, the only issue I had with the keyboard and mouse was the default control scheme. And by default, I mean the only one. No rebindable keys, no alternate control setups. The only option you are given input-wise, and it's not like the other options are exactly stellar, doesn't even have resolution options. But it does give you keyboard layouts, and it gives you 3. QWERTY, QWERTZ, and a ZERTY. AZERTY? I don't care. Now, catering to people with non-standard keyboard layouts is good and all, but fully rebindable keys allow you to cater to everyone, so I like that. But, as I said, I didn't have a lot of problems with it. The control scheme isn't bad, I just had a small amount of trouble during combat with it. Everything else is fine. Even the platforming, oddly enough. By the way, there's platforming. Isometric platforming! And, well, that's it. There's nothing else to say. It exists. It's not good, but it works. Most of the time. Actually, come to think of it, that's a good way to describe a lot of this game. Well, not that, but rather that it works. It's serviceable, not exciting. The gameplay isn't necessarily bad, but it certainly doesn't carry itself. It feels bare bones. Most of the puzzles and obstacles are the first, most obvious thing you would think of when presented with the character's abilities. Things that may be regulated to tutorials in other games. And it never gets past that point. None of them are particularly creative or interesting. None of them are difficult, per se. It just needed more. but also less of stuff. Just go with me on this, because while I do think the gameplay needs to be more fleshed out, it gets stale pretty quickly. The stuff I'm talking about was this town. This stupid, funded by a crowd, stretch goal of a Kickstarter town. I don't know. I don't like this town. Okay? I don't like the things you do in this town. I don't like having to talk to people in a certain order so I could finally talk to the person I knew was the important one 9 conversations ago. And I especially don't like it when that person sends me to a puzzle that I still do not fully understand the solution to. It's this one, by the way. That's the right one. You can trust me on this because I checked. And perhaps more importantly, I got a little off track, to be honest. This whole section really messes with the story's pacing. Before this, there's a big moment for the characters. They're all more motivated than ever to accomplish their goal, and they have to deal with these idiots for way too long. God, I hate this place. It doesn't even have a boss. How are we supposed to cleverly transition in? So the boss fights. Well, honestly, I don't have a whole lot to say about the bosses. None of them are memorable enough for me to really care. But one thing I will say is that I'm happy the majority of them weren't just mindless brawls. Most of the bosses have some gimmick or puzzle that's the focus, be it deactivating the shield and reflecting back projectiles, or a game of Simon, for some reason. I wouldn't necessarily give praise to any of the bosses individually, but given that the combat really isn't deep enough to carry anything other than gimmicky fights, I'm glad at least they were the focus. It's not exactly a glowing recommendation, but like I said, none of the bosses really stuck with me. They aren't a problem though. As before, they work. Most of the time. Kevin? Most of the time. Nope. With that taken care of, I do have a final bit to add, and that's because there actually was one boss that left me with some strong feelings, and that's the last one. The final boss fight is a roller coaster of emotions. Just not a good one. The first phase of the fight I think is fine. It's one of the few straight brawls. You just fight the guy. There's not a whole lot to it. Although my perception on this may be a bit skewed. I use this fight as an excuse to blow my hoard of consumables. But given your interaction with this guy in the story up to this point, a straight fight where you throw everything you have seems pretty fitting. The second phase, on the other hand, well, he's scary looking. Yeah, that's the last part of the game. Actually, wait, no. The last part of the game is you walking in a straight line for a bit because the magic man you met literally 30 minutes ago told you to. Right. Forgot about that. And, well, those two things make Crossing Souls Climax not climactic. It's I don't like it. I don't like the ending. And honestly, after everything I've said at this point, you might think that's how I feel about the entire game, which isn't true. I'm not really sure. The thing is, I keep asking myself if there's anything about the gameplay that stands out, anything that would make me want to play this over something similar, and there just isn't. At its very best, the gameplay is mediocre. There's nothing about it that kept my attention. What did keep my attention, though, was everything else. The presentation, the art style, music, setting, hand-drawn animated cutscenes, and the story, which, despite all the problems I have with it, did keep me invested. All of that is great, and where the uniqueness of this game comes from, but that's just it. It's a game, and the gameplay of this game isn't interesting past the first 2 hours of an 8-hour experience. If it had gone somewhere with its mechanics, expanded on them in some way, if the last hour didn't play exactly the same as the first, and the second, and the third, this could have been something really special, something great, but as it stands, I'm not even sure it's good. And that makes me sad. Are you serious? Holy shit!